Today's video examines Islamophobia in Australia, specifically looking at the relationship between racism, place, and mobility for Muslims in Australia. My name is Dr. Rhonda Itaoui and I am a researcher from Western Sydney University. So what is Islamophobia? Islamophobia has been defined in many ways, but overall it refers to a fear or a hatred of Islam that manifests in anti-Muslim racism being directed towards those who appear to be Muslim or who are of the Muslim faith. This results in negative and hostile attitudes towards Muslims, including prejudice, discrimination, and exclusion based on religious practices, dress code, and other signifiers such as a Muslim-sounding name or skin color. Research on Islamophobia has highlighted that Islamophobia relies on a racialized construction of Islam and its followers as being an other. Based on this premise, Muslims are constructed as being different, inferior, barbaric and dangerous, or a threat to Australia's culture and way of life. Therefore, Islamophobia has been labelled as a cultural or new form of racism, which is a racism that is based on the belief that some people are inferior to others by way of their culture. Unlike biological or old racisms that have been referred to in the past, cultural racism uses the rhetoric of cultural difference rather than racial or biological inferiority to other and exclude particular cultural groups. Within this framework, Islam is viewed as inferior to and incompatible with Western cultures like Australia. So what does Islamophobia look like? I will draw on some research here to highlight the ways in which anti-Muslim racism has been documented in previous research. The Scanlon Foundation Social Cohesion Report from 2018 to 2019 found that negative attitudes towards Muslim groups were in a marginally higher range than the negativity recorded towards other groups such as Buddhists and Hindus or Christians. In research by the Western Sydney University Challenging Racism Project in 2017, 63% of respondents expressed some degree, ranging from slightly to extreme, intolerance and discomfort with Muslim Australians. Overall, 70% of Muslims surveyed in that research said they had experienced racism on public transport or on the street, and this was followed closely by experiences of racism online, at a shop or restaurant, and within an educational institution. Within that study, Muslim women were more likely to experience racism on public transport or in the street than Muslim men. And in addition, Muslim women were also more likely to experience racism across different public spaces and workplaces. Recently, the Islamophobia Register released its 4th annual Islamophobia in Australia report. Within this report, it combines all of its data from 930 incidents from 2014 to 2021. Most victims in this research were women, 78%, and most perpetrators that were recorded to subject other Muslims to attacks were men, 70%. 64% of victims that had reported Islamophobic incidents to the Islamophobia in Australia register said that they were attacked based on their religious appearance or insulted verbally based on their association with the religion of Islam. Physical attacks, when they took place, were most common in leisure places and public places. So this brings us to the question, where does Islamophobia take place? Like other forms of racism, anti-Muslim abuse can take place across various spaces and settings. According to the Islamophobia Register documents, of those 930 incidents since 2014, this abuse takes place mostly in shopping centres, construction sites, streets, public transport, car parks, and schools or universities. Therefore, Islamophobia takes place both in public places and guarded areas such as educational institutions. Islamophobia has impacts on the lives of Muslims across various aspects of life, including employment opportunities, education, and their emotional and mental well-being. And these are common factors and impacts of racism when experienced by victims. Some Muslims record reactions to threats and discrimination, including sadness, anxiety and worrying, disappointment, fear, and anger. My study on the geographies of Islamophobia also highlight that Muslims, in response to experiences of Islamophobia, perceive different areas of Sydney and other parts of the world in different ways according to their perceived threat of facing racism. Therefore, the othering of Australians and the othering of Muslims in particular can teach Muslims to feel less comfortable or more comfortable in certain neighbourhoods based on the threat of racism. Racism produces spaces of fear for religious minorities such as Muslims in spaces such as beaches, streets, shopping malls, driving, or on public transport. This can impact the way that Muslims choose to engage in different areas or choose to disengage from different areas across the city, undermining the ability for Muslims to access public spaces fairly and equitably compared to other Australians. I'd like to point to the Christchurch mosque attacks as an example of when Islamophobia turns fatal. This situation involved the brutal murder and massacre of 51 Muslims in 2 mosques in Christchurch at the hands of an Australian perpetrator. This incident demonstrates the growing anti-Muslim racism and the way in which global hate networks are being used to incite fear and violence against Muslims. This aligns with a broader intensification of online hate directed towards Muslims that has been documented in previous research. This perpetrator was involved in this online hate network and used these networks to plan and execute the killings. In the aftermath of the Christchurch attacks, support from the Australian community by officials, interfaith groups, and the broader Australian society were also overwhelmingly positive. Local mosques received letters of support, flowers, and visits from those who wished to show their support and their solidarity with Muslim communities, and to show the message that Muslims are welcome in Australia. Overall, this video has covered that Islamophobia is a form of racism that has a wide range of spatial impacts on Muslims. This includes how they map the city in their spatial imaginaries, how Muslims engage in public spaces, their mental, emotional well-being, and financial opportunities related to employment and the ability to gain an education without facing abuse and discrimination. Violent effects of racism on Muslim bodies and sites have been uncovered across Muslim institutions that are vandalized or Muslim bodies that are targeted by everyday forms of racism. What I would like to highlight is that Muslims remain resilient and are supported by anti-racist bystanders and allies. Muslims belong in Australia, as do all culturally and religiously diverse groups, and therefore we must continue to fight towards the equality and the equal access of Muslims to a wide variety of spaces in Australia.